There can be no doubt that one of the most iconic, dynamic, and mystifying personalities in the world of golf in the last 30 years is David Feherty. And the new book from John Feinstein tells the story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the really, really funny. Here's a little sneak peek.
Tiger always called Feherty farty because of their farting contests. And Feherty was one of the few guys that Tiger did like. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that David never wanted anything from him.
The story of Feherty is straight ahead. Throughout all of the years of covering golf in my world, I guess we're right around the 30-year mark of doing so. The one broadcaster who has most captured my funny bone is David Feherty. And so when I heard about a new book out, just kind of diving into his story, I definitely wanted to talk to the author, who also, by the way, has a prolific body of work. John Feinstein has been a guest on my program a few times before. And this new book, John, called Feherty, The Remarkably Funny and Tragic Journey of Golf's David Feherty. I've taken a dive into like the first half of it, and man, is it good. Welcome aboard. It's good to see you again.
Bill, thank you. Thank you for the kind words, and it's good to talk to you again.
David is a unique character to kind of take that dive into. Why'd you decide to go into Feherty instead of anybody else?
Well, you used the right word, unique, which is vastly overused in sports. Unique means one of a kind, and David is very much one of a kind. I've known him for a long time. Like you, admired his work on television. He has worked with me on a charity golf event that Tom Watson and I put on to raise money for ALS research for years. You know, Tom's caddy, Bruce Edwards, died of ALS in 2004. I wrote a book about Tom and Bruce called Caddy for Life. And Tom and I started this charity golf tournament. David and Tom are very close because Tom has helped David deal with his alcoholism dating back to 2006. So I spent a lot of time with David, got to know him well, and thought his story was just fascinating. Didn't know all about it until I sat down with him to research this book, but knew enough about it to believe there was a great book in the story, not because of anything I did, just because David's story is, as you said it, unique. Grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, has dealt with alcoholism his whole life, is, as you said, one of the two funniest people I've ever met in sports. The other was the late basketball coach, Jim Valvano. And everybody likes David. I told him at one point during the research, the biggest problem I was having was finding someone to say something bad about him, because he has this generosity of spirit that his wife Anita describes best. And so researching the book and then writing it was a joy for me, to be honest.
So a few years ago, when he was doing his one-man show, kind of a storytelling / stand-up show, he did it in Detroit when the Rocket Mortgage Classic was in town, and I reached out to his management team and ended up prior to the show, about an hour prior to the show, going into his dressing room and just doing an interview with him.
And he was a wreck.
He was a wreck.
Yeah.
I was shocked. I thought I was going to walk into the golf version of a stand-up comedian who was as relaxed, feet up on the couch, and he was very nervous.
Yep.
And then when he took to the platform at the Fox Theater, it was the David that I thought I was going to see in the dressing room. So did you encounter that he has some of that anxiety or that stage fright?
Well, there's no question.
Yeah.
I mean, he is manic depressive. He takes he takes 21 pills a day. I think that's the right number for various maladies, including being bipolar. And he, as I said, has dealt with alcoholism since he was a teenager. Also had drug issues in the 90s that he has since put behind him. But David is an introvert. by nature. And that's the amazing thing about him. You witnessed it firsthand. I've sat with him before he went on television, before his stand-up, before he did Feherty, his terrific show on Golf Channel, and he's a wreck. He expects something to go wrong. He thinks his ADD is going to kick in, and he's going to forget a story midway through. But then, as you said, he gets on stage, and he's Feherty, and he's that way too, Bill. When he's in a restaurant or walking through an airport, whatever it may be, people come up to him, and you would think they were his best friend, for selfies, for autographs, just to tell a story, whatever it might be. And that's one of the things that's interesting in talking to his two surviving children. As you know, he lost his son, Shay, to a drug overdose 5.5 years ago. But his two other children, Rory, not named after Rory McIlroy, Rory Feherty's older than Rory McIlroy, and Aaron, both say the thing they're most proud of with their father is the way he treats people. Not what he does to be a celebrity, but the way he treats people when he encounters them in public.
I don't know if the non-golfing public appreciates David's comedic timing and abilities nearly as much as those of us who have watched him just in tournament settings for a few decades. I don't remember the place, but I remember my couch when I heard David say, just seconds after on camera, we watched a marshal get hit in a very tender area on one hop by a wayward tee shot. He said, "Well, that's the kind of injury where you ask the doctor to remove the pain but leave the swelling." I literally rolled off the couch laughing. I've never heard anything more funny than that. I mean, this guy is a comedic, smart aleck genius, isn't he?
Yeah, no, he absolutely is. And the thing is, none of it is contrived. It's not like he writes a script or anything.
Right.
It's just he reacts to moments like the one you just described. Mike Perky, who was David's editor at Golf Magazine and is now working with him on the Live Tour, tells a story that the first time he realized David was unique, back to that word, was watching him right after he'd started working on TV. He was working one of those silly season events, and Lauren Roberts was playing, and Lauren Roberts hit a duck hook off the tee that went in the water and somehow bounced off a coconut and then landed on dry land. And a minute later, David was on camera holding up the coconut, and he said, "I'm holding here Lauren Roberts' bruised nut." And I'm not sure how many people could get away with that, but David gets away with it. And he gets away with a lot of lines because, again, getting back to what his wife Anita said, people sense that spirit of generosity that he has. As she said, the first time they went on a date, David showed up drunk. And when they sat down at the table, he took a straw and reached across the table and drained her drink. And at that point, she stood up. They were on a double date with mutual friends and said, "Guys, I'm sorry, I have to go." And David realized that he'd acted terribly and begged his friend to ask her to give him one more chance. And she did, and they hit it off. He was sober on the second date, and now they've been married 27 years. But the point of the story is, I asked Anita, "Why in the world did you go with him on a second date?" And she said, "It's a great question, but I always, even drunk, I sensed a kindness about him. And so I gave him a mulligan." And as she said, a lot of people have given David mulligans in life because of that. And I think that's true.
Does David know about, or did he cooperate with this book? Has he
Oh,
seen
yeah.
has he seen the finished product?
Yes, he has. As I said, David and I had been friends for years. And I went to him and I said, "I would like to write your life story." And what David said to me was very flattering. He said, "You're the only one I would trust to do it." And to say he was cooperative is an understatement, because, again, I'll give you an example. Early on in the process, he told me a story about working at the Masters. He was never comfortable there. He felt he didn't belong. I mean, he's a blue collar kid from Bangor, Northern Ireland. And there he is at Augusta National. And on Thursdays and Fridays, he would do the late night show with Jim Nantz. And there was a gap between going off the air and doing the show. one night David had a few drinks and then drove his golf cart into Butler Cabin and decided that he would move his car from the CBS parking lot to be right in front of Butler Cabin so he could leave quickly after the show. And unfortunately, having had a few drinks, he ended up on the par 3 golf course.
Oh boy.
Oh boy is right.
Oh boy.
And sure enough, when he realized where he was and came back around, there were 2 police cars waiting there. And David realized he was in trouble. Cop came up. He rolled down his window, and David noticed his name tag. It was an Irish name. I can never remember. It was Callahan or O'Reilly, something like that. And he thought, oh, maybe I can talk my way out of this. But the first thing the cop said was, sir, have you been drinking? And David looked at him and in his David-like way said, well, I can see why you never passed the test for detective
Oh dear.
with that first question. So a minute later, he was in Ziploc handcuffs, and the cops called Jack Stevens, who was then the chairman of Augusta National, and said, what do you want us to do with this guy? And Jack Stevens said, just let him go. Because like many others, Jack had a soft spot in his heart for David. And when David told me that story, I said to him, are you sure you want this in the book? You know, because it's kind of an embarrassing story. And he looked at me, he said, John, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And we're not going to pull any punches. And my life has a lot of punches in it. So yes, put it in the book and let's go from there. And that's David.
It is David, and it makes some other aspects of his career path so confusing to me. The decision to leave NBC and go over and join Live. Let me back up just a little bit. I'll never understand why on earth CBS let him get away. They probably didn't want to write the check that Golf Channel / NBC was going to write that was going to allow him to do his Feherty show and commentate. But when he went to NBC, it's almost as if they held a production meeting with him before his first broadcast and said, now, David, no more funny stuff. Because when he went to NBC, not only did you never hear from him, but he was as droll as the guys they had brought him in to replace. So I didn't understand that. And I know that's not his character. So somebody from on high must have said, hey, no more funny jokes, which was, to be like telling Don Rickles, no more insults.
Right.
Then as he gets to the end of that time, with NBC, and you hear this announcement that he's going to go over and join this renegade tour, this Live tour, where nobody's going to see him anymore. You're not going to hear from him, and he's going to be forced to shill for something that is clearly, it's like Baghdad Bob standing in the streets of Baghdad telling you there's no problem here while the tanks are going behind him. It's such a dichotomy, at least for me, because I appreciated one of the things you said in the book that he said when first being part of the rookie orientation on tour, when they were coaching the rookies on how to answer questions in the press. And after a long rambling presentation by whoever the lady was that was trying to instruct them, Feherty raises his hand and says, why don't we just tell the truth?
Right.
Which I love that part of his life story. But why the decision to do what he's doing now, where they have to overhype stuff that is laughably not what we're seeing on if you can see it, not what we're seeing on camera. So how do you that's a long-winded question. How do you bring those two things to an equal spot?
Well, let me see if I can answer it and not be too long-winded, but the move from CBS to NBC, you basically had it right. He wanted to do the Golf Channel show. CBS would not want to do an interview show. CBS would not offer him a similar type of job. They wouldn't offer him something that went beyond just being a golf commentator. And he wanted to be more than just a golf commentator. So it was more about the work than the money. The money was good, obviously, but it was more about the work than the money. And then he will tell you he made a mistake because he had always walked with the last group on Sunday on CBS. And that was part of his genius, being up close to the players. I mean, even Tiger Woods liked him, for crying out loud. And Tiger doesn't like anybody. But he was closing in on 60 and he said, I'd like to be in a tower. And so they agreed and they put him in a tower. And having watched David both on the ground and in a tower, it's not the same because you're not up close. You're not even on the hole where you are. You're not watching the players live. You're watching the monitor, so you can tell the viewer that you're seeing what they're seeing. So that was one. That was a mistake David made, according to David, in going up in a tower because it wasn't the same. But the other thing that happened, Bill, and I've seen this up close, was the death of his son,
Mm.
Shay, in 2018 to a drug overdose. David always has and always will blame himself, even though people have told him repeatedly that he shouldn't. But he's a parent. I mean, as a parent myself, I understand. I don't understand, thank God, the horrible feeling. But David has not been the same person since Shay's death. He's still funny at times. He's still brilliant because he's a brilliant person. He still has that spirit of generosity, as shown by his cooperation with me on this book, among other things. But he also lost. He lost the Golf Channel show. They made so many financial mistakes in other areas that they decided to cancel the show, having nothing to do with its quality, which I think was a huge mistake. And he became and I use this word not in a literal sense, but a more sober David Feherty. Your description is accurate. And what happened as this was all going on, um, Greg Norman approached him and said, I want you to be our John Madden. And David has lived in this country long enough to know what that means and to be flattered by it. And he was going into his last year, the last year of his contract with NBC. And he saw Roger Maltby get retired. He saw Gary Koch getting retired. And he wondered about his future with NBC. And Liv made him a ridiculous offer financially. I was right near the end of the book when this all occurred in writing it. And I sent him a text and I said, seriously, you have to make me rewrite the last 2 chapters of this book so you can make a measly couple million more bucks? And he wrote me back. He said, John, it's not a measly couple million more bucks. It is a huge amount of money and it guarantees him work for 5 years. And you're right about the fact that right now nobody's watching. But also, but if you watch, I have been watching for obvious reasons. But if you watch, most of the shilling is done by his 2 partners, and most of it by what's the guy's name, Arlo White,
Mm.
soccer guy. He's not a golf guy,
Right.
and he talks about the team event every week as if it's the Masters, and the last few holes of a 54-hole tournament as if it's the U.S. Open.
Yeah.
David mostly does commentary. Jerry Foltz mostly does commentary, but you're right. They're both being paid at times to be shills for these events. And the thing I will say about David is this, and I'm biased, of course, because he's my friend. But when Liv was first bringing people in, you read all the comments from Phil Mickelson and others about, I just want to grow the game of golf, and this is a chance to take it to places on earth, blah 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 blah. David said, "I'm doing it for the money."
Yes, he did.
So again, going back to your point about his honesty, and let's just tell the truth, he did.
Question for you: are you as surprised as I am, and thankful that David's still alive?
Yes.
I mean, between the drinking and getting run over by a truck and all of the different things, I would have to think that is a man who, as he puts his head on the pillow at night, thanks the Lord that he's still putting his head on a pillow at night.
Well, and he thanks his wife Anita.
Mm.
I think first and foremost, he has said to me many times, if not for Anita, I would be dead. She has done the best she can to control his drinking. He's been on and off the wagon on a number of occasions. I mean, you can imagine he started drinking again after Shay's death. Understandable. Sad, but understandable. And Anita and his 2 children too. Rory, I talked to both Rory and Aaron, and I can't tell you, Bill, how impressed I was with the 2 of them. Rory gave the eulogy for Shay because David was completely incapable. I mean, he was completely frozen, their word, for days after Shay's death. And Rory gave the eulogy and was kind enough to send me a copy of it. And I hope you get to it in the book because it's extremely moving and eloquent. And but you're right. as Anita said to me, she said, when we were talking about the whole live thing, she said, this is the last chapter, and he's entitled to live it the way he wants, especially since he didn't expect to be living this last chapter.
Hmm.
So your point is very well taken.
Is it a case where he's frozen in those moments because of the realization that the very demons that plagued him took his son?
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, that father, that level of guilt of a father, man, oh man, that's just devastating.
One of the people I was able to interview for this book was Bill Clinton, because he'd been on Feherty and
Right.
liked David very much and was one of the first people to call him
Hmm.
after Shay died. And he told me that he kept saying to David, "Do not blame yourself. This is not your fault. Shay chose his own path, unfortunately." But he also said, as a father himself, you're never going to convince a father or a mother that they're not responsible when something like that happens to one of their children. And um, David's father was an alcoholic. In fact, his name is David William Feherty because the day he was born, his father had been drinking and filled out the birth certificate wrong. He was supposed to be William David Feherty. And David's an alcoholic, and Shay had drug problems. And a lot of David's guilt comes from the fact that, as he said, he was Shay's number one enabler. Shay knew if he went to him for money, he'd get it. And Shay would lie about why he wanted the money. And David said he knew deep down he was lying, but he wanted to believe him. So he lied to himself. And eventually he was told, excuse me, by therapists and by family, you got to stay away from Shay. You got to stay away from him. And he did the last few months of his life, but unfortunately it was too late.
We often lose track of the fact that David was a fantastic player of this game, was right on the cusp of a major championship win, of course, played on a Ryder Cup team. Um, in the analysis of the world of Feherty, how good could he have been?
Yeah, it's a question we'll never know the answer to, because he never believed how good he was. You mentioned that Open Championship in '94 at Turnberry. I was actually there. That was one of the first times I ever spoke to him. And he was 2 shots out of the lead going into Sunday and missed a few putts, makeable putts around the turn, and ended up finishing tied for fourth. And he says now, looking back, he thinks part of him just didn't believe he was good enough to be a major champion, that he wasn't, his word, worthy of being a major champion. And it wasn't like he missed the putts on purpose or anything like that. He just didn't putt with the confidence he needed to putt with under those circumstances. Nick Price ended up winning. You might remember he finished eagle birdie to win. But David was, as you said, when he turned pro at 17, he dropped out of high school as a junior. He was a 5 handicap, which hardly qualifies you to turn pro. But he worked and worked at his game. He was a club pro for another number of years. By the way, he worked at a club where the clubhouse was blown up twice while he was working there. Again, an example of what it was like growing up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But eventually made it to the European Tour and won 5 times there. Tells an hysterical story about his first win. It was in Venice in the Italian Open, and they were staying on one of the Venetian islands where the golf course was. And of course, there were no cars allowed. And the tournament directors supplied the players with tricycles to ride from the hotel to the golf course each morning. And David said it looked like this gigantic circus every morning. And when he won, they gave him the trophy and he put it in the basket of the tricycle to go back to the hotel. But he was a very good player. And as you said, made the Ryder Cup team, the famous War by the Shore Ryder Cup team in 1991, and beat Payne Stewart.
Yeah.
Was the U.S. Open champion at the time. So eventually injuries, his terrible first marriage, and his drinking ended his career prematurely. But that was when Gary McCord discovered him, in a sense, in a locker room during a rain delay, and asked him to join him the next day, Friday, on the tower for USA Network, which was doing the Thursday Friday telecast. And as they walked off the tower, Gary said, "This is what you're going to do next." and I just hope you'll consider CBS. And as we all know, he ended up going to work for CBS. By the way, he said the first time CBS approached him, it was Rick Gentile, who is the executive producer, and Lance Barrow, who had just taken over from Frank Chirkinian as the producer of CBS Golf. He said he was sitting in a bar in Akron during the World Series of Golf. And he said because he was still an athlete, he was drinking Gatorade with his vodka. And he said these two men approached and said, we're from CBS. And his first thought was, oh, God, 60 Minutes is doing an investigation on athletes who drink. And it turned out they wanted to offer him a job.
You mentioned that he had this unique relationship with Tiger, and I'm struck by the idea that sometimes addictive, destructive personalities flock together, right? So they both shared some vices, so to speak. And I remember the final Buick Open, 2009. I walked to the back nine inside the ropes. Tiger had a comfortable lead. Of course, Feherty was with the group, and kind of watched the two of them interact. And then on 18, when I think, I could be wrong, but I think the lead was 3 for Tiger. And it was an emotional time because for the mid-Michigan region, everybody knew that this tournament was going away thanks to Congress demonizing golf during the financial downturn. And GM just was like, we just can't keep doing this because we asked for bailout money, blah, blah, blah. So it was emotional is my point. And I watched Tiger start laughing, like covering his mouth with his hands, and his shoulders are shaking, and Stevie Williams' shoulders are shaking, and Feherty's shoulders are shaking. And I'm what am I, 50 feet away? I have to stay by the ropes, of course, and they're in the middle of the fairway. And I'm like, what in the world are they laughing about? Only to find out later that they were having a passing gas contest.
Yes.
Between Tiger and Feherty during the final round of the final Buick Open.
Right.
These birds of a feather flocked together, didn't they?
Yeah, and in fact, Tiger always called Feherty farty because of their farting contests. And Feherty was one of the few guys that Tiger did like, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that David never wanted anything from him. And Tiger was so used to everybody wanting something from him in his life, and he would tell him dirty jokes. And he would pull his cap down so the camera couldn't read his lips, and he would tell him dirty jokes during the round, and they would have farting contests. The one time a farting contest went wrong for David was in Charlotte on a Saturday, actually, in 90+ degree heat. They were having a farting contest, and David had an accident. And Gary McCord said he knew something had gone wrong when he saw David walking from 16 green to 17 tee, and he put on his rain pants in 90 degree heat. And when the round was over, again, David was one of the few people Tiger willingly spoke to after a round. And Lance Barrow said, when we come back from commercial, I want you to talk to Tiger. So David grabbed Tiger, and they were standing there waiting to come out of commercial. And Tiger says, "What is that smell?" And David said, it's okay. We're almost done. And Tiger started to run away. And David literally reached out, grabbed him, and held him at arm's length long enough to do the interview, and then sprinted for the clubhouse. And by the way, David tells that story on himself. Gary just confirmed it for me.
Oh, that is so funny. The book is called Feherty, The Remarkably Funny and Tragic Journey of Golf's David Feherty. And my hope is that his final chapter is filled with more joy than it is panic attacks, and that he can fully embrace what he has come to mean to the game. I say this, John, with all sincerity. I cannot imagine telling the story of golf, especially the Tiger Woods era of golf, without having David Feherty as part of that story being told. I think at some point in my lifetime, we will see him inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame as a broadcaster. Maybe the live move damaged those chances, but do you think Feherty belongs in the Hall of Fame, not as a player, but as a broadcaster?
Oh, 100%. I mean, again, tell me someone who is unique to the sport and to the game and to television the way David is. David changed golf on television. Gary McCord opened the door. But David's humor, his relationship with Tiger, as you mentioned, his relationship with players in general, was unlike anybody else. I mean, Johnny Miller, I thought was great at what he did. And Johnny Miller, of course, was a Hall of Famer as a player. But a lot of the players didn't like him because he was quote unquote too critical. David had a way of being critical without angering the players because he did it with humor. And so but again, I'm biased, but do I think he belongs in the World Golf Hall of Fame? 100%. But you mentioned Liv, and remember who runs the World Golf Hall of Fame?
Right.
PGA Tour. So
there's a lot of layers to this onion, my friend.
Right.
That's for sure.
Until there is some kind of rapprochement between the Tour and Liv, which I think will come. I think it has to, because you got to have all the best players playing the same tour. But until that comes, they're not going to put David in the Hall of Fame.
Well, folks, I think you've gotten an idea now that you need to pick up this book, Feherty, The Remarkably Funny and Tragic Journey of Golf's David Feherty, and a fascinating character. We have not seen one like this come along in a long time, and John Feinstein is certainly the best storyteller in moments like this. So, John, thank you so much.
Bill, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.